July 22nd, 1944. Nightfall settled over the Sulu Sea like a velvet curtain, erasing the horizon and turning the water into a sheet of black glass. The calm was deceptive. To the Japanese destroyers fleeing Tawi-Tawi, it looked like salvation. In truth, it was the beginning of an unseen disaster. For weeks, Tawi-Tawi had been pounded by American carrier strikes. Fuel depots burned. Ammunition barges exploded in the lagoon. Submarines stalked every route out of the anchorage. With losses mounting, the Imperial Navy ordered its remaining destroyer squadrons to withdraw north under darkness. These were not ordinary ships. They were the last elite torpedo veterans crews who had trained for years with the Type 93 Long Lance, the weapon that had shattered Allied cruisers across the Solomons. The night was their domain. The sea was their ally. At least, that was the belief. Rear Admiral Masanori Tanegashima stood on the bridge of the destroyer Suzukaze, listening to the faint hum of engines behind him. 8 destroyers followed in a long, disciplined column, running darkened ship, every porthole sealed. Their fuel reserves were low, their crews exhausted, but morale rested on a single, unshakable doctrine. As long as the Long Lance existed, Japan still ruled the night. What Tanegashima could not know was that another group of ships, silent, unseen, had been waiting for him. Northwest of the pass, U.S. destroyers drifted at minimal speed, engines throttled down to keep sound low. These ships formed what planners called the Tawi-Tawi barrier line, a picket designed to detect fleeing Japanese units. It was meant for submarines, not for a surface squadron. But radar had changed the nature of war. The officers aboard these American ships did not stare into the darkness with binoculars. They stood inside sealed combat information centers, lit by soft red bulbs that glowed against plotting tables and radar scopes. Shortly after 9 o'clock, a radar operator aboard USS Hutchins noticed faint returns moving steadily north. At first, the echoes appeared uncertain small blips, almost indistinguishable from sea clutter. But the operator watched them gather strength. More shapes, more returns, then a clear pattern, a straight-line formation, 9 ships advancing at more than 20 knots. No one expected Japanese destroyers here. Yet the radar did not lie. The report traveled quickly across the American line. Radios whispered, multiple surface contacts, column of ships, likely enemy destroyers. On USS Heermann and USS Hull, officers studied the glowing traces with a feeling that was equal parts disbelief and anticipation. They had trained for years to fight blind in the darkness. Now the moment had arrived. Captain Raymond Kelso, commanding the barrier group from USS Coney, reviewed the plots with an expression of calm that steadied the men around him. He understood what the radar showed. A Japanese formation was sailing directly into a funnel they did not know existed. The Americans, for the first time in the Pacific, held every advantage, position, surprise, and most importantly, information. Kelso gave the order quietly, almost gently. All destroyers, stand by torpedoes. The radar operators continued tracking the Japanese column, updating bearings and estimations every few seconds. The enemy never wavered. They were running straight into the jaws of an ambush. Aboard Suzukaze, Admiral Tanegashima sensed something was wrong. The wind had died completely. The night carried an unnatural stillness, as if waiting. He ordered his lookouts to double their vigilance. The men scanned the horizon with night binoculars, seeing nothing but darkness and the pencil-thin line of phosphorescence in their wake. One officer approached him hesitantly. "Sir, earlier warnings reported American pickets in this sector. Could they be—" Tanegashima cut him off, not angrily, but with certainty born of doctrine. The Americans do not fight at night. It was the same belief that had served Japan well in 1942. Now, it was disastrously outdated. He assumed the enemy was blind. In reality, the Americans were watching him with perfect clarity. At 9:27 p.m., the decision was made aboard USS Heermann. The distance was closing. The angle was ideal. The firing solution was complete. Kelso leaned toward the voice tube and delivered 3 words that would end 7 ships. Launch on radar. No flares pierced the sky. No searchlights flickered. No human eyes confirmed the target. 80 American torpedoes left their tubes, gliding into the night with barely a ripple. For a full 30 seconds, nothing happened. Aboard the Japanese destroyers, the crews heard only the steady rhythm of engines and the faint hush of waves sliding past the hull. Then, a lookout aboard Akikaze cried out, voice cracking in terror, "White water starboard!" Tanegashima turned his head just in time to see the first torpedo wake slicing toward the column like a silver wound across black water. Another wake followed. Then another. The sea itself seemed to ignite with trails of phosphorescent death. The first explosion struck Hamikaze. A plume of fire erupted as the forward magazine detonated, turning the ship into a rolling inferno within seconds. The blast illuminated the entire formation. Men aboard the other destroyers shielded their eyes as burning debris rained down. A second torpedo slammed into Nowaki, splitting open her engineering spaces. Within moments, she lost steering and began to drift sideways into the path of even more incoming torpedoes. Then came Isakaze. A hit on her port side shredded her boilers and knocked out half her engines. The ship veered sharply, colliding with another destroyer as fire swept through her decks. The long lance, the weapon Japan believed could not be defeated, had turned against its masters. In the chaos, several Japanese ships attempted to fire their own torpedoes, but the launches were rushed, panicked, and poorly aligned. One spread even arced back through their own formation, striking a sister ship amid the confusion. On the American screens, the blips began to vanish, one after another. Clean, clinical erasures. The radar operators called out calmly. One ship gone. Second ship vanished from scope. Third ship exploding. Gone. There was no cheering, no celebration, only the quiet tension of men watching a disaster unfold miles away in the darkness. Within 9 minutes, 7 Japanese destroyers had been torn apart. The 8th, burning fiercely from bow to stern, limped away into the night before finally stopping dead in the water. Admiral Tanegashima understood in those final moments that everything Japan believed about night warfare had collapsed. The long lance had not saved them, the darkness had not hidden them, and the Americans had struck without ever seeing a single silhouette. Radar had rewritten the rules of naval combat, and Japan's night-fighting legacy died in the waters of Tawi-Tawi Pass. When the first Japanese destroyer vanished in a column of fire, the men aboard the remaining ships felt a jolt of disbelief more than fear. They had fought night battles before. They had seen cruisers explode, tankers torn in half, ammunition barges turned into burning islands. But this was different. There had been no searchlights, no muzzle flashes, no roar of American engines cutting through the dark, just silence and then annihilation. On Suzukaze, Admiral Tanegashima gripped the railing as the horizon erupted in bursts of flame. His brain raced to impose structure on the chaos. Perhaps a minefield, a submarine pack, a misfired long-lance salvo. Anything but the unthinkable. That the Americans had fired on them first, fired accurately, fired in darkness, fired without ever revealing themselves. Torpedo wakes streaked across the Black Sea, dozens of them, weaving through the Japanese formation like serpents. Officers shouted, contradictory orders, turn starboard, turn port, full speed ahead, engines to idle. The commands collided, and so did the ships. Isakaze, crippled and drifting, struck the bow of Uranami, scraping metal against metal as both hulls groaned under the impact. Men lost their footing, sliding across the deck as fire poured from ruptured fuel lines. Then another torpedo hit. The explosion tore through Isakaze's forward magazine, sending a pillar of flame 200 feet into the air. The concussion wave slammed into the bridge of shattering windows and throwing crewmen to the floor. Tanegashima staggered, bracing himself against the bulkhead as heat washed over the bridge like the opening breath of a furnace. Somewhere behind him, a junior officer whispered the truth aloud for the first time. "They are firing on radar." The words carried the weight of a death sentence. For years, Japanese naval doctrine had celebrated the night. Darkness was a sanctuary, a battlefield where optics, discipline, and torpedo skill outclassed American fire control. But the Americans had quietly rewritten the rules. Their destroyers no longer hunted with eyes. They hunted with signals, echoes invisible to the human world, but unmistakable to the machines that now governed war. A second wave of torpedoes arrived, these from USS Hoel and Monson. They moved in geometric precision, crossing paths exactly where radar plots had placed the Japanese formation seconds earlier. Uranami attempted to accelerate clear of the threat, but the torpedo found her midships, lifting the destroyer partially out of the water before dropping her back in pieces. Flames consumed the bridge almost immediately. Men trying to abandon ship slipped into waters slick with burning oil. Aboard USS Heermann, radar operators calmly marked the disappearance of each enemy echo. One lost at bearing 178, another fading gone. Multiple secondary explosions, 3 ships no longer returning. The American CIC felt eerily detached from the violence. The officers weren't watching the battle, they were watching its absence. Every vanished blip told the story of another ship dying somewhere beyond the dark horizon. Some sailors later said it felt wrong, like fighting blindfolded but knowing exactly where to swing the blade. Others described a sense of clinical inevitability, as if the Japanese ships had entered a tunnel from which there was no exit. Technology had stripped the battle of its chaos, reducing it to geometry and timing. But aboard the Japanese destroyers, chaos was absolute. Tanegashima's last intact escorts tried to fire their own long lances. The sleek torpedoes, the pride of the Imperial Navy, plunged into the water in perfect spreads, deadly enough to annihilate a cruiser division under the right circumstances. But the conditions were no longer right. The American destroyers were not where Japanese doctrine said they should be. They were not closing in, they were not chasing. They were not illuminating themselves with gunfire. They had fired from positions the Japanese had never detected and were already maneuvering away under radar control. Several long lances arced harmlessly into open water. One spread curved back into the burning wreck of Nawaki, detonating against her stern and breaking the ship's spine. Survivors who had jumped into the sea found themselves dragged beneath the waves by the suction of their own flagship dying above them. Meanwhile, Admiral Tanegashima made a desperate attempt to reorganize his column. "To north, maximum speed." But the engines could not answer quickly enough, and the sea was filled with torpedoes still searching for targets. A massive explosion erupted off Suzukaze's port side as a torpedo struck the waterline. The shock threw sailors across the deck. Steam burst from ruptured pipes. The ship listed immediately, water pouring into the engineering spaces. Tanegashima looked out into the night and saw a scene that did not resemble naval warfare as he understood it. There were no enemy ships visible, no gun flashes to identify direction, no silhouettes to target with optics. The Americans were ghosts, present only in the results of their attack: flames, splintered hulls, the dying cries of sailors struggling in burning water. A realization settled over him, slow, heavy, suffocating. Night combat was no longer Japan's weapon. Darkness no longer protected the hunter. The Americans had stolen the night through mathematics, frequency pulses, and machines that could see what humans could not. The long lance was not obsolete, but the doctrine around it was. The last Japanese destroyer to attempt escape was a Matsukaze. Her captain ordered full speed north, engines screaming in a desperate effort to outrun the explosions behind them. But she was detected instantly by USS Coney. A single radar update corrected the firing angle, and a salvo of torpedoes raced toward her. One struck her bow, blowing it apart. Another detonated beneath the bridge. A Matsukaze buckled, broke, and slipped beneath the water in under 3 minutes. Then, suddenly, The sea fell silent. The American destroyers slowed, their radars sweeping the water like invisible searchlights. One by one, the remaining Japanese echoes faded. Fires crackled on the water's surface. Oil burned in streaks that glowed red against the night. Bodies drifted among the wreckage. 9 minutes had passed. 7 destroyers were gone. Japan's last elite torpedo division had ceased to exist. For the U.S. Navy, the shock came not from victory, but from its ease. Officers stared at the radar scopes long after the last echo vanished, trying to reconcile the silent sterility of the screens with the violence unfolding miles away. They had expected a duel. Instead, they had witnessed an erasure. For the Japanese Navy, the shock went deeper. Survivors later reported that the destruction at Tawi-Tawi Pass felt like the universe shifting. A doctrine they believed eternal had died without warning. Night, once a loyal ally, had become a traitor. And the long lance, the legendary weapon of the Pacific, had been defeated not by better torpedoes or clever tactics, but by a machine that simply refused to be blinded. When dawn finally bled across the Sulu Sea, the water carried an unnatural stillness. Smoke clung to the surface in low-drifting sheets. Burned beams and twisted steel floated among slicks of black oil. Here and there, shattered lifeboats bobbed like broken teeth. The rising sun revealed what the night had concealed, an entire destroyer squadron erased, scattered across miles of ocean. American patrol craft were the first to arrive. Their crews had been awake all night, listening to the distant thunder of explosions, unsure what they would find. What they discovered was not a battlefield. It was a graveyard. Charred debris crackled softly as seawater cooled it. A torpedo tube drifted upside down, its loading crane bent like a twisted rib. A lifebuoy marked Hamikaze floated past, blackened by fire. Few Japanese survivors remained. Those pulled aboard American ships were exhausted, burned, or dazed into silence. One petty officer, barely conscious, kept repeating the same phrase in a shaking whisper, "Mitsukuranai teki," the enemy we could not see. His words were written in the after-action report. They would become the unofficial epitaph of the battle. The U.S. destroyer crews were shaken as well, not by resistance, but by its absence. Combat felt different when the enemy never appeared in the flesh. There were no silhouettes on the horizon, no torpedo wakes rushing toward them, no adrenaline from seeing another ship through binoculars. Instead, the men stood in sealed CIC rooms, watching glowing green traces vanish one by one, their destruction confirmed not by human eyes, but by machines. Officers struggled to describe it. One wrote, "It was like listening to a storm behind a curtain." Another said, "I felt like a surgeon, not a sailor." The victory felt clean, but not triumphant, precise, but not heroic. In their reports, several commanders remarked that naval combat had crossed a threshold. Seeing the enemy was no longer necessary. Knowing the enemy through pulses, signals, and data was more than enough. The Japanese survivors would describe the same event with the opposite emotion. What to the Americans felt like a sterile, distant engagement felt to them like pure terror. A battle where the sea itself seemed to attack without warning. Many survivors insisted that no human force had done this, that the Americans must have deployed some divine or elemental weapon. Others believed the Americans had developed a torpedo impossible to detect. But the officers who understood radar grasped the truth instantly. This was not a new weapon. This was a new age. That morning, a coded emergency transmission left the drifting wreckage of a Matsukaze's last functioning radio. It reached the Japanese base at Zamboanga before noon. The message was short, fragmented, and grim. Enemy destroyers, fired without visual. Heavy losses, long lance, ineffective. Night unsafe. The phrase, "night unsafe," sent tremors through the naval staff. For years, Japanese doctrine had rested on one sacred pillar. That night combat belonged to Japan. The Type 93 torpedo, the elite night navigators, the decades of training under cover of darkness, all of it formed the backbone of Japan's naval confidence. Now, that backbone had snapped overnight. When the first detailed reports arrived days later from American propaganda broadcasts, from coast watchers, from fragments of radio intelligence, the truth settled in Tokyo like a suffocating fog. 7 destroyers, gone in 9 minutes. Japan had never lost ships that quickly, not even at Midway. Admiral Toyota, head of the combined fleet, read the transcripts of radar-directed firing with a heavy stillness. The Americans had launched torpedoes without lights, without flares, without any visual target confirmation. They had struck with mathematical precision. The sea had become their instrument. Toyota was an old-school officer, raised when naval warfare meant courage, optics, and intuition. But even he recognized what had happened. He quietly wrote a note in the margin of the battle summary: "Night warfare advantage transferred to enemy." He never said it aloud, but the implication was impossible to ignore. Japan's most sacred doctrine had just collapsed in a single engagement. In naval academies for decades, Japan had taught that courage sharpened the eyes, discipline stabilized the hand, and darkness equalized fleets. But courage could not outperform radar. Muscle memory could not outrun torpedoes guided by perfect angles. And darkness no longer equalized anything. In fact, it now favored the Americans. Word of the disaster spread across surviving Japanese destroyer crews like a whispered curse. Sailors began to speak of the invisible enemy ships that fired without showing themselves. A veteran petty officer wrote days later, "We were not defeated, we were undone." For the first time, a seed of fatalism took root in the heart of the destroyer fleet. In the weeks that followed, surviving Japanese commanders altered their doctrine. Night raids were restricted. Torpedo attacks, once launched with confidence, were now performed cautiously, even hesitantly. Destroyer captains, who once demanded aggressive maneuvers, now ordered their ships to run dark and avoid contact entirely. But it was too late. The Americans had seized dominance, not by sinking a fleet, but by shattering a mindset. The long lance myth, the belief that superior torpedoes guaranteed victory, had died at Tawi-Tawi Pass. It hadn't been broken by countermeasures, armor, or better weapons. It had been broken by information. Until that night, Japan believed the long lance controlled the sea. After that night, the Americans realized radar controlled everything around it. Historians would later look back on the fictional 9-minute destruction and see more than a lost battle. They saw the moment Japan stopped being an offensive navy and became a navy of survival. They saw when the Imperial fleet shifted from seeking opportunity to avoiding catastrophe. And they saw the quiet birth of modern naval warfare, not through decisive battleship duels, but through pulses of radio energy echoing across an empty sea. As the sun climbed higher that morning, American sailors aboard USS Heermann gathered at the railings. They looked across the gentle waves, now calm and deceptively peaceful. Nothing remained but drifting debris and a few scattered survivors. The battle that had rewritten doctrine was over before most of them even knew it had begun. One lieutenant said softly, "I never saw a single enemy ship." Another replied, "You never will not in battles like this." They were right. The age of eyesight was ending. The age of radar had arrived. And the night no longer belonged to Japan.